June 6, 1944. The metallic screech of torn aluminum echoed across the Norman countryside as Lieutenant Thomas Fraser's P-51 Mustang carved a violent furrow through French soil. His engine coughed its final breath, trailing smoke like a dying cigarette. What Fraser couldn't have known, as he stumbled away from the wreckage, was that his aircraft was about to become the most important classroom in the history of aerial warfare. Within hours, German recovery teams swarmed the crash site like surgeons around an operating table. They had done this dance countless times before, salvaging the mechanical corpses scattered across occupied Europe. But this particular Mustang would soon find itself wearing enemy colours, its American star replaced by the black cross of the Luftwaffe. More importantly, it would force some of Germany's finest pilots to confront a truth they had been desperately trying to avoid. The war was slipping through their fingers, and the reason was sitting right there in their hangar. By 1944, German fighter pilots were living in a world of comfortable delusions. Official briefings assured them that American aircraft were nothing more than crude flying tractors, mass-produced garbage that prioritized quantity over quality. The prevailing wisdom painted a picture of American engineering as hopelessly inferior, capable of building simple machines in vast numbers, but fundamentally incapable of sophistication. These beliefs weren't just propaganda talking points. They were psychological lifelines for men who needed to believe they still had a fighting chance. The mathematics of aerial warfare, however, were writing a different story entirely. American bomber formations penetrated deeper into the Reich with each passing week, escorted by fighters whose true capabilities remained shrouded in mystery and wishful thinking. German pilots returned from missions with fragmentary reports, contradictory accounts shaped by the chaos of combat, rather than systematic analysis. What they needed was something more concrete, more from traumatized Erkdeniable than second-hand stories rue. They needed to fly the enemy's machine themselves. Enter Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, a man who understood that winning required more than courage and skill. It demanded knowledge, the kind that could only come from intimate familiarity with your opponent's weapons. In 1943, following direct orders from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, Rosarius formed what would become known as the Wanderzirkus Rosarius. Officially designated as the second Staffel of the Versuchs- und Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, this specialized unit had one mission that would prove both enlightening and demoralizing in equal measure. They would capture, repair, and fly every Allied aircraft they could get their hands on. The concept wasn't entirely new. Both sides had been testing captured aircraft throughout the war, but Rosarius would systematize the approach in ways that maximized its tactical value while simultaneously delivering psychological hammer blows to German pilot morale. His unit became a traveling circus of revelation, visiting operational Luftwaffe bases across Germany and occupied territories with a collection of enemy aircraft that would force German pilots to abandon their most cherished assumptions about Allied capabilities. The recovery operation itself had become a masterpiece of German organizational efficiency. Specialized salvage teams operated across occupied Europe with the precision of a Swiss watch, racing against time to secure crash sites before advancing Allied forces could reclaim the wreckage. These teams could evaluate damage, assess repairability, and transport aircraft to centralized facilities with remarkable speed. The scale of Allied operations made captures inevitable through simple statistical probability. With thousands of sorties flown monthly, mechanical failures, battle damage, and navigation errors resulted in numerous forced landings on German-controlled territory. Fraser's Mustang fell into this category of recoverable captures. The aircraft had sustained damage during the intense fighter sweeps supporting the Normandy invasion, forcing an emergency landing in territory that remained under German control despite the chaos of D-Day. German recovery teams reached the site within hours. Following procedures that had been refined through 3 years of practice, they examined the aircraft carefully, assessed the damage, and determined that despite the violent landing, the airframe remained sufficiently intact for restoration to flying condition. The journey to Rechlin would prove to be the beginning of an education that no German pilot wanted to receive. Rechlin Testing Center served as the Luftwaffe's primary facility for evaluating captured enemy aircraft. The sprawling complex near Lake Müritz included extensive workshops equipped with specialized tools, comprehensive test ranges for various evaluation protocols, and runways specifically configured for evaluation flights under controlled conditions. Here, skilled technicians would perform mechanical miracles, rebuilding enemy aircraft from scattered fragments using nothing but ingenuity and salvaged components. The repair process for Fraser's Mustang required extraordinary resourcefulness. Technicians cannibalized parts from other crashed P-51s recovered across Europe, building an inventory of components that could be matched and fitted to create one airworthy machine from multiple damaged aircraft. The Packard 5-1650-3 Merlin engine underwent detailed inspection and repair using replacement parts obtained from various sources across the continent. This power plant represented a technological achievement that German engineers would soon study with uncomfortable fascination. The aircraft's machine guns were removed and replaced with ballast weights to maintain proper balance, following strict regulations that prohibited arming captured aircraft. Control surfaces received thorough examination for structural integrity. Hydraulic systems underwent pressure testing for leaks. Fuel tanks were carefully inspected for damage that could cause catastrophic failure during flight operations. The distinctive razorback canopy was preserved and repaired, though German pilots would later note how the frame design restricted rearward visibility compared to later bubble canopy variants. After weeks of meticulous work, the Mustang emerged wearing German markings. The fuselage bore the Luftwaffe code T9+HK, while the tail and undersides received bright yellow paint for easy identification by German pilots who might otherwise mistake it for an enemy aircraft. The propeller spinner gleamed with yellow paint, and a red band adorned the nose of the engine cowling. Following standard identification procedures, this particular machine was destined for service with one of the most unusual units in aviation history. What German test pilots discovered when they first climbed into that cockpit would shatter every comfortable assumption they had nurtured about American engineering capabilities. The moment they advanced the throttle and felt that Merlin engine respond with smooth progressive power delivery, they began to understand that everything they had been told was wrong. The acceleration down Rechlin's runway was notably shorter than expected for an aircraft of the P-51's weight and size, clear testimony to both the engine's substantial output and the airframe's aerodynamic efficiency. Once airborne, the Mustang demonstrated handling characteristics that fundamentally challenged everything German pilots thought they understood about American aircraft design philosophy. The flight controls were beautifully harmonized, with aileron, elevator, and rudder forces perfectly balanced across the entire speed range. Control forces increased predictably with speed while decreasing smoothly at lower velocities without becoming oversensitive. The aircraft responded crisply to control inputs without displaying the nervous characteristics that plagued some fighters. Roll rate exceeded that of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 significantly and approached the exceptional performance of the Focke-Wulf 190. This capability allowed rapid changes in flight direction that proved critical for both offensive and defensive maneuvering in combat situations. The aircraft could be thrown aggressively into various maneuvers without any troubling tendency toward departure from controlled flight or spin entry. But the true revelation lay in the performance envelope that German test pilots discovered through systematic evaluation. The climb performance numbers that emerged from systematic testing generated something approaching panic among German tactical planners. The P-51B could maintain excellent climb rates to altitudes well exceeding 30,000 feet, where that two-stage supercharged Merlin continued producing substantial power even as progressively thinner air severely degraded performance in German fighters equipped with single-stage superchargers. This wasn't just a minor advantage, it was a fundamental shift in the tactical equation that governed aerial combat over Europe. German fighters had been designed around different assumptions, different priorities, different wars. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 excelled in the turning fights that characterized combat over Poland and France. The Focke-Wulf 190 dominated at medium altitudes where its BMW radial engine delivered maximum power. But American bomber formations typically operated between 25 and 30,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold but defensive firepower remained lethal. At these altitudes, German fighters gasped for oxygen while the Mustang breathed easily, its sophisticated power plant delivering performance that seemed almost supernatural to pilots accustomed to engines that wheezed above 25,000 feet. The speed trials conducted under controlled conditions confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting with increasing alarm. The P-51B could achieve approximately 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude, significantly faster than the Bf 109G's 386 miles per hour and the FW 190A's 408 miles per hour when measured under comparable conditions. This wasn't just a numbers game played by engineers in comfortable offices. This speed differential translated directly into tactical control of every engagement. American pilots could choose when to fight, pursuing fleeing German fighters when conditions favored attack. More critically, they could choose when not to fight, accelerating away from unfavorable encounters with German fighters that lacked sufficient speed to pursue effectively. German pilots discovered they could not force combat on a Mustang whose pilot recognized an unfavorable situation and chose to disengage. This fundamental shift in tactical initiative represented a psychological blow that went far beyond simple performance statistics. The wing design revealed American engineering sophistication that contradicted years of propaganda about crude mass production. Based on NACA laminar flow airfoil sections, the P-51's wing generated substantial lift with minimal drag compared to conventional designs. While true laminar flow remained elusive in operational conditions due to manufacturing tolerances and surface imperfections, the wing nonetheless delivered exceptional aerodynamic efficiency that contributed directly to the aircraft's remarkable range and fuel economy. This wing maintained its effectiveness across an extraordinarily broad speed range, from relatively low-speed handling during landing approaches through high-speed performance during combat maneuvering. The consistent, predictable handling characteristics reduced pilot workload while enhancing combat effectiveness, allowing pilots to concentrate on tactical situations rather than fighting their aircraft's quirks and limitations. Dive performance revealed another area where the Mustang demonstrated clear superiority. The aircraft could dive at very high speeds without encountering the severe control stiffening that plagued many fighters when approaching maximum design speeds. Pilots could pull out of steep high-speed dives without requiring excessive physical effort, and the airframe remained stable throughout without tendency toward flutter or structural failure. This capability proved tactically significant because diving attacks represented a primary German doctrine for engaging bomber formations and escorting fighters. The Mustang's ability to follow German fighters through high-speed dives while maintaining full control authority eliminated a key tactical advantage that German pilots had relied upon since the beginning of the war. When escape through diving was no longer guaranteed, German pilots found themselves trapped in engagements they could not win and could not escape. Turn performance presented a more nuanced picture that required careful analysis and would later form the basis for the only tactical recommendations German instructors could offer their students. The Mustang could not match the sustained turn rate of the Bf-109 in level flight at moderate speeds, particularly as the German fighter benefited from leading-edge slats that automatically deployed during high angle of attack maneuvering. In sustained slow-speed turning fights at medium altitudes, the lighter and more compact German fighter held a measurable advantage in both turn radius and turn rate. However, German pilots discovered through systematic testing that the Mustang's clear superiority in speed and climb rate allowed skilled pilots to avoid sustained turning engagements entirely. The American fighter excelled at converting speed to altitude and altitude back to speed efficiently, enabling pilots to maintain energy state throughout combat maneuvering. This capability allowed Mustang pilots to engage when advantageous and disengage when threatened, forcing combat on their terms rather than accepting the enemy's preferred engagement geometry. The structural strength and robust construction philosophy impressed German engineers, who examined the airframe in systematic detail. The aircraft was substantially built with significant safety margins engineered into critical structural components throughout. This robust approach contrasted markedly with German design philosophy that often pushed structural limits to absolute minimums in pursuit of weight reduction and maximum performance. The P-51 could sustain significant battle damage that would have destroyed lighter German aircraft and still return home successfully, a capability that translated directly into pilot survival rates and aircraft availability for subsequent missions. American engineering philosophy clearly emphasized survivability and maintainability, accepting somewhat higher empty weight in exchange for durability that kept aircraft and pilots in combat longer. This represented a fundamentally different approach to fighter design, one that prioritized operational effectiveness over theoretical performance maximums. Range capabilities astounded German pilots accustomed to severely limited endurance in their own fighters, which rarely exceeded 90 minutes of total flight time, including combat operations. The P-51B carried substantially more internal fuel than German fighters, and the aerodynamically efficient wing design translated this fuel capacity into truly extraordinary range that seemed almost incredible to pilots whose combat radius barely exceeded 200 miles under optimal conditions. With external drop tanks attached under the wings, the Mustang could fly missions exceeding 8 hours duration, covering operational distances that appeared nearly impossible to German pilots, whose entire tactical doctrine was built around fuel limitations. This massive range advantage fundamentally transformed bomber escort operations in ways that proved strategically decisive and deeply troubling to Luftwaffe commanders who understood the implications. Early in the war, German fighters could simply wait until shorter-range Allied escorts reached their fuel limits and turn back toward their bases, then attack unprotected bombers during the most dangerous portions of their missions deep in German territory. The Mustang completely eliminated this tactical window, providing continuous escort coverage throughout entire missions, regardless of target distance. German fighters now had to fight through screens of superior escorts to reach bomber formations, dramatically increasing the risk every German pilot faced on every interception mission. The maintenance accessibility surprised German ground crews familiar with the sometimes extraordinarily difficult servicing requirements of their own aircraft, particularly when working under field conditions with limited equipment. The Mustang's engine cowling opened in multiple sections that provided excellent access to the Merlin engine, and its accessories, fuel systems, hydraulic components, and electrical systems. Panels throughout the airframe could be quickly removed to reach internal systems for inspection or repair. The overall design clearly reflected American emphasis on rapid maintenance turnaround and high operational availability, recognizing that aircraft sitting on the ground contributed nothing to combat effectiveness, regardless of their theoretical performance capabilities. This philosophy would prove increasingly important as the war progressed and German maintenance capabilities deteriorated under the pressure of parts shortages and undertrained personnel. The Wundertürkis at Rosarius took their captured and repaired Mustang on an extensive tour of operational Luftwaffe fighter bases across Germany during late 1944, visiting numerous locations where frontline units desperately needed realistic intelligence about what they faced in combat. At each stop, the unit established temporary operations and conducted comprehensive demonstrations that would prove both educational and demoralizing in equal measure. The demonstrations typically began with scenes that bordered on the surreal. German pilots and ground personnel gathered on flight lines to watch enemy aircraft taxi past their own fighters, bearing Luftwaffe markings and bright yellow identification stripes. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These weren't abstract threats described in briefings or distant silhouettes glimpsed through gun cameras. This was the enemy made tangible, rolling past their own aircraft with the casual confidence of superior engineering. Experienced German test pilots would then take the captured Mustang through carefully choreographed flight demonstrations designed to showcase specific capabilities. High-speed passes at low altitude dramatically illustrated the aircraft's significant velocity advantage over German types. The distinctive whistle of the Merlin engine at full throttle became a sound that haunted German pilots long after the demonstrations ended. Climbing displays to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet showed the remarkable high-altitude capability that made American bombers effectively untouchable by most German interceptors. The roll demonstrations proved particularly demoralizing. German pilots watched as the Mustang executed crisp aileron rolls that displayed how quickly the aircraft could change direction in combat. The maneuvers weren't just impressive from an aerobatic standpoint. They represented tactical flexibility that German pilots knew they could not match in their own machines. Each roll was a visual reminder that American pilots possessed advantages that went far beyond simple numbers. Mock dogfights against operational German fighters provided the most valuable and simultaneously most devastating component of these demonstrations. Selected experienced Luftwaffe pilots would fly their own aircraft against the captured Mustang in carefully controlled simulated combat under direct observation of their squadron mates. These encounters strips away any remaining illusions about relative capabilities in ways that no briefing or written report could achieve. One such demonstration occurred at an airfield hosting Jagdgeschwader 1 during the autumn of 1944, as Allied bomber operations intensified and German losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The base commander has most arranged for several of experienced pilots to fly mock engagements against the captured P-51, hoping to gain practical knowledge they could share with their less experienced squadron mates who are dying at alarming rates. The German test pilot flying the Mustang demonstrated tactics that American pilots routinely employed in actual combat, using the aircraft's overwhelming advantages in speed and climb performance to maintain energy throughout the engagement, while studiously avoiding situations where the P-51's lesser turn performance might become a liability. The demonstration was conducted with professional competence, but also with an almost clinical detachment that made the lesson even more chilling. German pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190 has attempted to engage the Mustang using standard Luftwaffe tactics that had proven effective against earlier Allied fighters. They discovered with uncomfortable clarity the extreme difficulty of successfully engaging an opponent whose pilot understood and properly utilized energy management techniques combined with the aircraft's performance advantages. Every tactical option they attempted was systematically negated by the Mustang's superior capabilities. When German pilots pursued aggressively, the P-51 simply accelerated away, opening distance faster than pursuing fighters could close it. The gap widened with mechanical inevitability, leaving German pilots watching their target disappear beyond effective engagement range. When they attempted to climb and gain advantageous position above the Mustang for diving attacks, the American fighter outclimbed them, reaching superior altitude first and reversing the tactical situation entirely. Most frustrating of all, when German pilots tried to force sustained turning fights where their aircraft's superior turn performance should have provided decisive advantage, the Mustang pilots simply refused the engagement. The P-51 would extend away using its speed advantage, then reverse back into the fight with renewed energy when conditions favoured attack. German pilots found themselves constantly reacting to American initiatives rather than dictating engagement terms themselves. The mock combat sessions proved sobering for pilots who had maintained hopes that superior tactics and aggressive flying could overcome material disadvantages. Watching their most experienced squadron mates systematically outmaneuvered by a single enemy, aircraft demonstrated clearly that German fighters faced opponents with fundamental and decisive tactical advantages, particularly at the high altitudes where bomber escort combat typically occurred. This pattern of uncomfortable revelation repeated itself across numerous Luftwaffe bases, where the Wunderzirkus Rosarius conducted demonstrations throughout late 1944 and into early 1945. German pilots arrived at these sessions expecting to learn exploitable weaknesses in American aircraft design. Instead, they discovered the extent of their own disadvantages in ways that could not be dismissed or explained away through wishful thinking. The captured aircraft demonstrations provided concrete evidence that contradicted years of propaganda about American industrial and technical inferiority. These pilots had flown combat missions, believing their opponents were equipped with crude machines produced by a nation more concerned with quantity than quality. Direct experience with the Mustang revealed sophisticated engineering that matched or exceeded German achievements in critical performance areas. Walter Dahl, who commanded fighter units during this period, later described the profound impact these demonstrations had on pilot morale and tactical thinking. Formation leaders who flew the captured aircraft gained understanding of Allied capabilities through direct personal experience rather than second-hand reports of uncertain reliability. This knowledge proved invaluable for realistic tactical planning, but it also forced acknowledgement of Germany's deteriorating position in the air war. Following demonstration sessions, squadron leaders conducted detailed briefings with their pilots, sharing specific recommendations based on their observations and direct experience with captured Allied aircraft. These sessions emphasized identifying the increasingly limited circumstances under which German fighters retained exploitable advantages, while acknowledging the growing areas where Allied superiority was simply overwhelming. The recommendations that emerged from these programs reflected harsh tactical realities that German pilots had to accept if they hoped to survive. Avoid high-altitude engagements where the Mustang's supercharged engine provided decisive advantage. Never attempt to outrun American fighters in level flight or shallow dives. Focus on forcing slow-speed turning fights at medium altitudes where German aircraft retained some performance edge. Disengage immediately if the tactical situation became unfavourable rather than pressing attacks that were likely to prove suicidal. These tactical guidelines represented a fundamental shift from the aggressive offensive doctrine that had characterized Luftwaffe operations earlier in the war. German pilots were essentially being taught to fight defensively, seeking limited opportunities rather than pressing attacks with confidence in their equipment's superiority. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated for pilots who had entered the war believing in their inherent advantages. By late 1944, the broader strategic situation made even these defensive tactics increasingly academic. Fuel shortages severely limited training time for new pilots, resulting in inadequately prepared aviators being sent into combat with minimal experience. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots faster than replacements could be trained, even under compressed programs that sacrificed thoroughness for speed. Aircraft production, while remaining surprisingly high despite intensive Allied bombing, could not replace losses quickly enough to maintain force strength. More critically, the quality of late-war German fighters suffered from material shortages that forced the use of substitute components and dispersed manufacturing that reduced quality control effectiveness. Pilots were flying aircraft that were less reliable than earlier production examples while facing opponents equipped with consistently high-quality machines produced by undamaged American factories. The training revelations from captured aircraft often served primarily to demoralize rather than inspire, as pilots realized the full extent of their disadvantages. Understanding intellectually that the Mustang could outrun, outclimb, and dramatically outrange German fighters offered limited practical benefit when those same pilots still had to engage these superior aircraft in defense of German territory under direct orders from commanders who had no alternatives to offer. The technical intelligence gathered from captured Mustangs extended far beyond simple flight testing and combat evaluation. German engineers at facilities like Rechlin systematically disassembled components to understand American manufacturing techniques, material selections, and detailed design approaches. They studied the wing structure and airfoil sections with meticulous attention, attempting to comprehend how American designers had achieved such aerodynamically efficient performance. The Packard Merlin engine received particularly intense scrutiny as engineers sought to understand the sophisticated two-stage supercharger system that enabled such impressive high-altitude performance. The fuel system was analysed for its contribution to the aircraft's extraordinary range. Hydraulic systems were evaluated for their reliability and maintenance characteristics compared to German equivalents. Throughout these investigations, German engineers noted consistently high-quality materials and sophisticated manufacturing techniques that enabled true mass production without significantly compromising performance standards. American access to strategic materials allowed designers to create structures that effectively combined strength with acceptable weight while maintaining production efficiency. Germany faced increasingly severe shortages by 1944, forcing the use of substitute materials that often proved inferior in strength, durability, or manufacturing characteristics. The investigation revealed manufacturing techniques that maintained remarkably tight tolerances across thousands of individual aircraft, something German production could no longer achieve given resource constraints and production dispersal. The captured Mustang, designated T9 plus HK, served with the Wunderzirkus Rosarius until December 1944, when the aircraft and its pilot were lost under circumstances that remain unclear in historical records. By that point, the machine had travelled extensively across Germany, visiting numerous bases and providing direct education to hundreds of German pilots who gained invaluable first-hand knowledge of American aircraft capabilities. Other captured P-51s served similar roles, with at least 2 additional Mustangs operating with the unit at various times during 1944 and early 1945. These aircraft bore different code designations, but served identical functions, forcing German pilots to confront uncomfortable realities about their tactical situation through direct experience rather than abstract briefings. The broader implications of German pilots thoroughly understanding superior American fighters extended well beyond immediate tactical considerations. The Mustang represented tangible evidence that American industrial capabilities equaled or exceeded German achievements in critical areas, contradicting fundamental assumptions about relative national capabilities that had been carefully cultivated through years of propaganda. This realization challenged core beliefs about German technological superiority and contributed significantly to declining morale among pilots, who increasingly understood they fought at severe disadvantage that no amount of skill or courage could fully overcome. The psychological pressure of flying combat missions While knowing intellectually that your opponents possessed decisive advantages in aircraft performance, numerical superiority, and logistical support required extraordinary mental resilience that bordered on fatalism. Production statistics told a devastating story about relative industrial capacity that made German defeat mathematically inevitable. American factories were producing approximately 500 P-51s monthly by late 1944, with output climbing even higher during peak production periods. This figure exceeded total German single-engine fighter production of all types combined, while American aircraft were equipped with reliable engines, sophisticated instruments, and radio equipment that actually functioned consistently. The quality gap extended beyond mere performance specifications into the realm of pilot preparation that would prove equally decisive. American aviators arrived at operational units with extensive training that German pilots could only dream of achieving by 1944. While Luftwaffe pilots were being rushed into combat with barely 100 hours of total flight time, their American counterparts typically possessed between 200 and 100 hours of total flight time, 100 and 400 hours of comprehensive instruction before seeing their first combat mission. This training disparity manifested itself in ways that went far beyond simple stick and rudder skills. American pilots had practiced formation flying until it became second nature, learned instrument procedures that allowed operations in weather conditions that grounded German units, and received gunnery instruction using actual ammunition rather than theoretical discussions. They understood their aircraft systems intimately because they had been provided with detailed technical manuals that German pilots rarely saw for their own machines. The psychological impact of these revelations created what German medical officers began documenting as a new form of combat stress. Pilots who had once approached missions with confidence born from years of early war victories now exhibited physical symptoms when American fighters were reported in their operational areas. The distinctive sound of Merlin engines approaching at high altitude could trigger panic responses among ground personnel, who understood that survival meant finding cover immediately. Veteran German pilots, who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching, spoke of Mustangs in hushed tones decades after the war ended. The aircraft had become more than just another enemy fighter. It represented the materialization of American industrial might in a form that German pilots couldn't ignore or dismiss through tactical cleverness. The fuel crisis that gripped Germany during 1944 added another layer of futility to the situation German pilots faced. While Mustangs could remain with bomber formations for hours, engaging in extended combat, while maintaining sufficient reserves for return flights to England, German fighters operated under severe fuel restrictions that limited mission duration and tactical flexibility. Pilots were forced to husband precious aviation gasoline like misers counting coins, calculating every minute of flight time against dwindling reserves. Training flights became increasingly rare luxuries that most German pilots simply couldn't afford. New aviators arrived at operational squadrons with theoretical knowledge, but virtually no practical experience in the aircraft they would fly in combat. The contrast with American training programs, where fuel flowed like water and pilots could practice maneuvers until they achieved muscle memory perfection, highlighted yet another dimension of German disadvantage. The maintenance situation painted an equally grim picture of declining capabilities. German ground crews struggled with part shortages that forced creative solutions bordering on mechanical artistry. Components designed for one aircraft were modified to fit another. Substitute materials replaced critical parts when originals became unavailable. Engines were rebuilt using salvaged components of questionable reliability. Meanwhile, American aircraft received maintenance from well-trained crews equipped with proper tools, genuine spare parts manufactured to original, specifications, and technical documentation that explained every system in detail. The operational availability rates told the story in stark numerical terms. German units were fortunate if half their assigned aircraft remained mission-capable at any given time, while American squadrons routinely maintained readiness rates exceeding 80%. The intelligence gathered from systematic Mustang evaluation found its way into desperate German attempts to develop countering aircraft. Projects like the high-altitude TAR-152 and the revolutionary jet-powered Me-262 represented recognition that existing German fighters simply could not compete with advanced Allied types like the P-51. These programs consumed enormous resources while producing aircraft that arrived too late and in numbers far too small to influence strategic outcomes. Even the impressive Me-262, with its substantial speed advantage over any piston-engine fighter, suffered from chronic reliability problems that limited its operational impact. The jet engines required frequent replacement, consumed vast quantities of increasingly scarce fuel, and demanded concrete runways that became prime targets for Allied bombing. Most critically, the few experienced pilots capable of maximizing the jet's potential were the same irreplaceable veterans needed to train new pilots and lead conventional fighter units. The captured Mustang program ultimately served as both revelation and epitaph for the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. German pilots who climbed into enemy cockpits expecting to discover exploitable weaknesses instead found themselves staring into the face of their own defeat. They had entered the war confident in their superior training and aircraft, only to discover, through bitter experience, that their opponents possessed overwhelming advantages in every dimension that mattered strategically. The P-51 Mustang didn't just outperform German fighters, it represented American industrial might made manifest, a flying symbol of the vast resources and sophisticated engineering capabilities that would ultimately bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of superior machines flown by better-trained pilots. When German aces finally understood what they were truly fighting against, they realized the war had been lost before it truly began.